Hello, I'm Montse Alvarado, and this is EWTN News In Depth. Pandemic worship restrictions, 1 year into a COVID lockdown. A look at how the church is coping, some places easing up and others still shuttered. From the clergy tending to the spiritual needs of their parishioners, to the legal minds working to reopen places of worship, to personal stories of medical professionals and patients leaning on their faith to get them through. The pandemic's religious impact 1 year later.
So it's the isolation. That is what's the biggest thing that, just being there by yourself and having time to think.
Hospitalized with COVID and living to tell about it, we hear from our own EWTN colleague.
But I'm here to tell you that it works, it's real, and we'll never forget to pray for people.
And the power of prayer brings a man very ill with the coronavirus back from the brink of death. EWTN News In Depth is next. Welcome to EWTN News In Depth. For more than a year now, the world has struggled through the COVID-19 pandemic. In America alone, more than 500,000 people have died. The economic toll has been devastating, and normal day-to-day life has been upended. The impact has also been severe in the religious community. Places of worship closed or the size of services limited. 1 year later, we pause to take an assessment. Where are we now? In the next hour, we'll take a look at the COVID religion story from a spiritual, legal, and medical perspective. We begin with the impact on church attendance. From the EWTN Vatican Bureau, here's reporter Colin Flynn.
On March the 27th, 2020, these images of Pope Francis walking up the steps in front of St. Peter's Basilica in the dark and in the rain symbolized the bleakness of the coronavirus situation as Italy became the worst affected country in Europe. As part of lockdown restrictions, all churches were ordered to close and the faithful were unable to attend Mass. But after Italian bishops lobbied the government, churches reopened less than 2 months later, with face masks now mandatory and a ban on all choirs. A study by the European Centre for Law and Justice in November of 2020 found that out of more than 40 European countries, Spain, Poland and the Netherlands were the only ones where public worship, even during the most severe lockdowns, was never prohibited. In contrast, it found the countries with the tightest restrictions on religious ceremonies were France, Belgium, Great Britain and Ireland. In Ireland, since December of 2020, public masses have been completely banned. Last week, the Irish government introduced a new law making it a criminal offence to attend certain indoor gatherings, one of which is Mass. Archbishop Eamon Martin, Ireland's Catholic primate, is urging the government to reverse it. In the small parish of Mullahoran in the middle of Ireland, Father PJ Hughes is the parish priest. He is refusing to stop celebrating public Mass, despite the police visiting him on a number of occasions and issuing him with a €500 fine.
I took a stance because I believe that the people have a divine right to live their faith. And the numbers just kept coming to me. Every day I would have between maybe 8 and 25 or 30 people at Mass. They were coming to pray as far as I was concerned, and remember, prayer is very powerful and prayer can move mountains.
And in the last few days, the Irish government told faith leaders in Ireland that it plans to reopen churches next month.
The celebration of Mass is ended.
In stark contrast to Ireland, on the other side of Europe, Poland is one of the countries which has never prevented people from attending Mass. But rules were introduced, like hands must be sanitised and social distance respected, and only a limited number of faithful are allowed to attend. In addition to this, the confessional boxes are covered with plastic layers. With a cap on the number of people allowed to enter the churches for Mass, many of the Masses are now broadcast online and on TV. This is proving to be very successful, with Masses becoming some of the most viewed broadcasts in the country.
To give you an example, just one Sunday Mass, live from the Shrine of Our Lady of Jasna Góra, was watched by about 3 million people, which means about 10% of the Catholics in Poland.
Like the Boyzowski family, who follow Mass every Sunday on TV, A good alternative, but according to a study by the church in Poland, many watching would rather return to church. In Lithuania, religious ceremonies have too always been permitted, but with restrictions, and the government advised people to remain at home and participate online. At the parish of St. Virgin the Comforter in Vilnius, the capital, they came up with a compromise. Father Algirdas Tol Iatas invited parishioners to attend Mass in their cars, flashing their headlights to indicate if they would like to receive Holy Communion.
That feeling of the communion is strong, even though we sit in the car and we can only wave or get out of the car.
In France, public worship was initially completely banned, and after an appeal from the bishops was dismissed by the government, Catholics took to the streets in protest, praying outside churches, despite threats from French police to issue them with tickets. And in France, masses have only recently resumed. In Hungary, last weekend, the large parishes and cathedrals reopened their doors to the faithful. Roughly half of Hungarian churches have been closed since March. Parishioners of the Diocese of Budapest say that they are happy to be able to receive the sacraments once again.
It was quite challenging for all of us, because the Eucharist is the source of our faith.
The Hungarian Church is now preparing to host the Eucharistic Conference this September, which is expected to be attended by Pope Francis. In Europe, Colm Flynn, EWTN News In Depth.
In the U.S., California became the first state to order residents to stay home after the World Health Organization declared COVID a pandemic in March 2020, and many other states followed suit. In an effort to protect parishioners, Catholic dioceses across the nation began to voluntarily shut down churches, consulting with medical professionals to develop safety protocols to stop the spread. Masses were moved online so parishioners could continue to take part virtually. Some religious communities moved services outdoors, but some cities and states restricted services outdoors, and many created an all-out ban on indoor services. At the very least, churches, synagogues, and other places of worship complied with a capacity cap, masking, and social distance guidelines. Early on in May of 2020, more than half the country, 29 states and Washington, D.C., placed numeric caps on how many people could take part in indoor worship services. Those are highlighted in red on this map. The state of New Hampshire had a percentage cap. You can see that highlighted in yellow. And 20 states, colored in green, had no restrictions. Today, 40 states have no restrictions. 10 states have percentage capacity limits, mostly ranging from 25 to 50% capacity. But in our nation's capital, in red, there remains a numerical cap as well as a percentage limit of 250 people or 25% capacity. Though the situation is improving, the fallout from the initial shutdowns of places of worship and its lingering effects are still being felt. To give us their experiences about the effects these shutdowns have had on their communities, we're joined now by Rabbi Mitchell Rocklin, the president of the Jewish Coalition for Religious Liberty, Jason Atkins, the director and general counsel of the Minnesota Catholic Conference, and EWTN executive editor and Washington, D.C. bureau chief, Dr. Matthew Bunson. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today for this important discussion. Jason, you and Bishop Hying were at the forefront of both pastorally suspending Mass, but then reopening 2 months later. What made opening so urgent for you in May?
Well, we need to get the sacraments to our people. The Eucharist is the source and summit of our life, and we believe the sacraments are efficacious. They're not just a wafer that you receive, but they are transformative. They're transformative of our own lives and help us transform the world. And there was a deep hunger in our community for the Eucharist. People had been receiving the sacraments in a creative way, especially confession, but people were really hungering for the Eucharist, and we wanted to make it available. So when our governor invited businesses and organizations to present plans for reopening, we did that and worked really assiduously with our government and government officials to reopen our churches here, and then ultimately had to say we were going to do this because the state doesn't have jurisdiction over when and how divine worship is offered.
And in June, under the Madison-Dane County's previous order, shopping malls, bars, restaurants, all these other commercial entities were allowed to open at 25% capacity, while houses of worship were subject to an arbitrary 50% cap, right, regardless of how large the church building was. How long did that last?
Well, I can't speak for what happened in Wisconsin. Here in Minnesota, there was, retail therapy seemed to be the order of the day. Shopping might be a religion for some, but it doesn't replace the real thing. And so bars, restaurants, pet grooming, shopping centers, casinos, pet grooming industries, medical cannabis, abortion clinics were even open, but religious services were closed. And so when that came to pass, we said that we need to do a different way. We said we're going to open our churches. We can do it safely. We presented a plan, and eventually the governor came to the table, and we negotiated something that allowed up to 250 people or 25% capacity. And then a few weeks later, that was changed to 50% capacity. But the government can't treat religious organizations or churches in a discriminatory fashion, even during a pandemic. There's no pandemic exception to the Constitution, and we're going to be sure to assert our rights and our religious liberties.
And religious liberty affects not just the Catholic community, but other religious groups. Rabbi Rockland, thank you so much for joining us. I know that you're on your way back from your Army chaplain duty. In addition to fighting for religious liberty, you're also part of our armed services. Thank you for your service. Why was suing to open up Jewish schools so important to your community in New York?
Sure, yeah. I'm on my way back from the National Guard duty right now, but I'm on the civilian side. My main work is focused on Jewish schools, which, it's interesting for the Orthodox Jewish community, of which I'm a member. Schools are actually, in a way, even more important than places of worship. Places of worship are very important. Synagogues are lifeblood of the community. But in some ways, religious schools for Orthodox Jews are even more important because they have a very large array of religious studies that really inculcate children with the faith from a young age. And it's really part of a community. And so when the pandemic hit, Jewish schools made tremendous efforts to institute safety precautions of all sorts. But even schools, we had one school that we helped represent together with the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. And the school had 0 cases of COVID. It was actually the safest place that a student could be. But Governor Cuomo sought to shut it down along with so many other schools. So we sued to reopen them.
And why was this anti-Semitic targeting by Governor Cuomo so dangerous? I know that last year's FBI hate crimes report showed an uptick in crimes against the Jewish community. Was this a coincidence?
We do not think it's a coincidence. We think that the way that the governor spoke at a press conference, stereotyping Orthodox Jews, using photographs of gatherings that he claimed happened recently, but were actually many years old, even from before the pandemic, implying that Jews are gathering in large numbers all over the place, along with some of his recent comments about Orthodox Jews that were reported. We really saw anti-Jewish animosity, which really has a very dark history and something that we would hope never to see in the United States or New York specifically.
Anti-Semitism is the original hate. Matthew, can you explain why closures for the Catholic community are so devastating?
Well, it can be summed up as we've heard from a number of people in this discussion, as well as in Colin Flynn's package. We are a sacramental church, not a virtual one. So the closing of churches was, to use your word, a devastating one for Catholics to be cut off from the source and summit of our life, the Eucharist. But at a time also when, depending upon your poll, as few as 50% of Catholics believe ardently in the real presence. This is also setting a disturbing and heartbreaking precedent, potentially, of telling Catholics basically that Mass really just isn't that important. And we're also shutting down churches at a time when they were most badly needed to provide pastoral and spiritual care to people in the midst of a pandemic. And then there are the host of religious liberty questions that have been distressing to Catholics from the very beginning of this pandemic.
Jason, one of the questions that many were asking themselves and are still asking now is bringing people back into churches affecting the spread of COVID-19? What can you tell us about that?
That hasn't been the experience in Minnesota at all. Even during our state's contact tracing efforts over the past year, churches were rather quickly dropped from that because we were proving to be safe environments and not being culprits in the spread of COVID. Obviously, there's a risk anytime you walk out your door. People are not obligated to come to Mass. They're still not obligated in Minnesota to come to Mass in person because there is a dispensation. But we've proven time and time again that our places are not a source of community spread. We presented a plan early in the pandemic. We've made good on that. We've been collaborative with public health officials, which we should be, but ultimately we can't be treated in a discriminatory fashion because faith is important. The Eucharist matters, our faith matters, and it's important that the church stand up for that and make that present to people because we do serve the well-being of the community. Home Depot is really important, I know, but liquor stores were kept open, and unfortunately, preventable alcohol deaths in 2020 increased by almost 20% here in Minnesota because it seems that liquor stores and the comfort they provide were more important than some of the things that religious gatherings provide to people.
That's very frustrating. I know for the Archbishop, it's one of the comments that he made about being able to bring people back for AA meetings. Rabbi Rockland, you speak for the Jewish community on many religious freedom issues. What was it like knowing that you were partnering alongside the Diocese of Brooklyn in reopening your houses of worship?
Yeah, one thing that we can look at this as a silver lining. Really, but an opportunity for more solidarity is that unfortunately, due to some of the regulations that were targeted at religious groups, I think that it brought people of faith together from many different backgrounds. There's been some polling data actually showing that that Americans may be growing more religious over the course of the pandemic, despite being away from houses of worship. And it was definitely it was definitely heartening. We heard from a lot of different people from a lot of different faith backgrounds and work together with them. And hopefully that's a positive development going forward, that we'll see more solidarity.
Jason, the Chauvin conviction was announced this week. The Washington Post noted that religious leaders are needed to have these important conversations about race, talking about this interfaith and religious impulse that Rabbi Rockland brought up. Was this the case in Minnesota?
Absolutely. It's important for people are looking for answers. We've seen in our discussions with political leaders, especially this legislative session, that people are really struggling as they're a time of polarization, pulling people apart. That vital center doesn't seem to be as holding as well, and people are looking for new answers. And I think the church is uniquely positioned to step in that conversation and say, who are we? What is our identity? Let's not make secondary our identities our fundamental ones. Let's talk about who we are as children of God. Whatever, in Christian, Jewish, Muslim, whatever, we're all children of God, and that should be the defining way in which we view ourselves and how we view our neighbor, and we should treat them accordingly, made in his image and his likeness. And so there's a real appetite, I think, right now, especially during these deep, polarizing conversations, for a perspective about who we are and how we define ourselves and how we should treat our brothers and sisters.
That's right, Jason. Matthew, quick last question to you. Can you talk to us about EWTN's coverage of the lockdowns? How was it unique? How was it different?
It was unique because EWTN was able to lead the way in so many ways in streaming masses, in providing Eucharistic adoration to millions around the world. On the news side, we were able to look at how the church adapted, how parishes adapted to overcoming that digital divide at that particular moment. We're also obviously covering the development of the religious liberty battles, and then also the very important Catholic perspective of the ethics involved with the vaccines. So we're really trying to provide a service to Catholics and all people of good conscience around the world.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. This is an important thing we're going to continue to watch. The court battles to get places of worship open have been intense. Legal minds who can explain that part of the COVID religion story join us up next. Welcome back to EWTN News In Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. At the start of COVID-19, we saw restrictions on most gatherings. It was in the phased reopening that we began to see a stark contrast in restrictions on religious gatherings versus secular gatherings. A string of legal battles for religious freedom reached the Supreme Court. This month, justices ruled against California's limits on home-based worship, including Bible studies. And just in time for Thanksgiving last year, the High Court barred New York from enforcing unequal limits on attendance at churches and synagogues in areas where commercial operations and retail were opening up. These legal battles were no small feat and directly protected Americans' fundamental right to freely exercise their religion and assemble. We're joined by Mark Rienzi, the president of the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty. Mark, you're my boss at the Becket Fund, but I'm wearing a very different hat today at EWTN. Thank you for joining us. And attorney Gabriela Gonzalez Araiza also joins us. Both of you are on the front lines of these important legal battles for religious freedom. Gabriela, last May, 2 months into the lockdowns, we started seeing these lawsuits. Why were they so important, and what were these religious groups asking for?
Well, really, these religious groups were just asking for equal treatment to similar secular groups that, as some restrictions were lifted for essential businesses and things like that, houses of worships were still restricted to certain numerical caps on gatherings.
Mark, these are emergency requests to the Supreme Court, right? Why were these houses of worship pushing to open back up?
Yeah, there were emergency requests because the the right to worship is an urgent and essential right, and people were laboring under these illegal and burdensome restrictions. So they were seeking the right to go back into church, go back into synagogue, and to worship, and to do it safely and responsibly, which they ultimately have been able to do.
And is there a reason why they were so desperately asking for emergency relief?
Sure, the governments in question were starting to open up and starting to allow political protests and starting to allow favored industries to go back. And the religious groups said, well, if staying 6 feet away from somebody and wearing a mask is good enough at the casino and good enough at the retail store, why isn't it good enough in a church or a synagogue? So they wanted to get back to what was important for them.
Gabriela, these cases have largely been framed by the mainstream media as Christian churches wanting to open up. Were there other faiths involved?
There certainly were. So actually one of the major cases, which was Becket cases, is Agudath Israel, which was representing Orthodox Jews.
Orthodox Jews. And what were they asking for?
They were asking for equal treatment to secular activities that were not being restricted in the same level as other activities. So in that case in particular, there were very strict caps, and there was also some allegations that New York was targeting Orthodox Jewish neighborhoods.
They were targeting them. That was religious targeting and maybe anti-Semitism?
Right.
Mark, what do these cases teach us about religious freedom and our rights during a pandemic?
Well, one, I think it's worth pointing out that many churches and synagogues and mosques at the very outset of the pandemic voluntarily shut down. They were trying to be good, responsible neighbors, take care of their congregation, take care of their community. But as things started to open up, it became clear that they were getting poor treatment. What I think the cases teach us is that we need to be vigilant in protecting our rights, and we need courts that will demand evidence from the governments. As the cases went on, and as the courts started to say to the government, hey, what's your reason or what's your proof for thinking church is more dangerous than a casino or some other activity? Turns out the governments didn't have proof. So it was the courts insisting on proof that really broke through and got us to the point where we are today, which is that worship is much more free than it was at the beginning of COVID.
And why is insisting on that proof so important?
It's important because if governments aren't put to their proofs, what they'll naturally do, I mean, these are human institutions, and what they'll naturally do is they'll favor their friends. They'll favor the political causes that they like. They'll favor the industries that they like. And if they're not particularly religious or religion doesn't matter to them, then they won't make that a priority. And our Constitution and our laws are set up that this is a fundamental right that people have a right to do, even if Governor Cuomo doesn't think it's all that important, or some other leader doesn't think it's all that important. Free citizens in America have the right to treat it as very important. And the only way you get it is by vigilance. People have to stand up and protect it, otherwise it goes away.
We have to stay vigilant. Gabriela, what are we looking at now? How have the courts changed the way they treat religion and religious freedom?
I think the court stated now very clearly that if there is any similar secular activity that's being treated more favorably than a religious activity, that's going to trigger strict scrutiny, and that's a very difficult barrier for the government to overcome. So as Mark was saying, they're going to have to put up much better reasons for why they're placing these restrictions.
And does this give you hope?
It certainly does. I think another consideration the court discussed early on was rising cases, the lack of treatments, the lack of vaccines, and those facts just don't exist on the ground in the same way that they did then. So I really think there is hope for the future and fewer restrictions.
Well, we'll keep watching this carefully. Thank you so much, Mark and Gabriela, for joining us and explaining this important topic.
God had me there for a reason, and it was to be able to pray with this woman. And, we were there together, and it was at times you could literally feel the Holy Spirit between the wall.
A member of the EWTN News family tells us his COVID story of hospitalization, isolation, prayer, and survival. We've talked about COVID's impact on church attendance and the legal battle to keep places of worship open and available to meet people's spiritual needs. Now, EWTN News In Depth turns to patients and medical professionals who know COVID in a very different way. One of those patients is a member of our family here at EWTN News. Capitol Hill correspondent Erik Rosales appears every evening on our daily newscast, News Nightly. But earlier this year, Erik disappeared from the air for 6 weeks. He was ill with COVID and battling for good health. Erik joins us now to talk about his experience surviving COVID and how it affected him both spiritually and physically. We also welcome Dr. Eustace Fernandes. He's a pulmonologist and critical care specialist in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Thank you both for joining us. Dr. Fernandes, let's start with you. You've been treating COVID patients this entire past year. What have those on the front lines learned about treating severely ill people? Have you modified or adjusted your procedures?
We have. It's incredible the amount we've learned in the last year. I'll give you a quick example. Early on in the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about ventilators and the need to put everyone on ventilators early on. We've since learned in the medical community that this may not be in every patient's best interest. Now we're focused on efforts to use non-invasive means to keep patients off ventilators. Early on, we talked a lot about a drug called hydroxychloroquine. Now we use a drug called tocilizumab, which there's good data that suggests improves outcomes for patients. So we've had tremendous leaps in the last year, a great deal that is largely unknown, but we continue to learn every day about this terrible disease.
It's fantastic to have these medical advances. Erik, you were sick for weeks.
Oh, I certainly was.
Yeah, checking yourself into the hospital. When did you realize that you were in deep trouble? And thank God you were never on a ventilator, right?
No, I never was on a ventilator, but I tell you what, my oxygen level dropped down to about 84%, wow. Which is very, as you heard from the doctor, wow, yeah, that was very, very low. As soon as I went into the hospital, I had actually passed out on the bathroom floor. Oh. And I got up from there. My wife, she heard a thump, and I went in. She went in there, and she says, "What's going on?" And so we ended up just driving to the hospital. And of course, because of COVID, she couldn't go inside, so she just had to drop me off there, and literally went inside. And that's when they did the oximeter on me and checked out. And yeah, it was 84% my oxygen level. They immediately put me on oxygen. Thankfully, I didn't have to go on a ventilator, but there were many, many people there in the hospital that had to go on a ventilator, and that was just very, very sad to see.
Yeah, you've told your work colleagues here at EWTN that one of the most alarming things that happened to you in the hospital was that deep sense of isolation. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's, when you go inside the hospital, of course, your wife couldn't go inside. My wife couldn't go inside to drop me off. And as soon as you get inside of a room, you were literally alone. And a big giant sign that says COVID patient inside, you can't go in. Every time the doctors and nurses, they want to be able to protect themselves. So they came in fully garbed up with not only their masks, but also little vacuums and everything hooked up to their bodies to prevent the virus from actually getting into their respiratory area. And they came in, checked your vitals, and then they took off. And I ended up calling Father Patrick here at EWTN many a time to pray with him. I called my church father as well over at St. Mary's to talk with him for a while. And it's the isolation. That is what's the biggest thing, that just being there by yourself and having time to think. And after 5 days of being hospitalized, I was ready to come home. So.
Yeah. Dr. Fernandes, you're hearing Erik's story, which I'm sure isn't new to you. I'm sure you've seen many patients many times experience that same isolation. As medical staff, what do you do to help patients with that?
Sure. There are a lot of things that we can do. Technology is a mixed blessing, but in the case of COVID-19 patients, we've been able to use things like iPads and iPhones or tablets to allow people to actually see one another when they're in that bitter isolation. So just seeing a familiar face or hearing a familiar voice, particularly in the intensive care unit where I do most of my work, is extraordinarily important and facilitated by technology. It doesn't make up for human touch, though, and the opportunity of doctors and nurses to go in and actually touch patients and pray with them and things like that has been extraordinary for me as a Catholic physician during the pandemic.
Yeah, I do have to say, doctor, that there was one particular nurse. Her name was Nancy, and she actually did come in, and we prayed together. She was a believer, and that really makes the difference there. I wanted to ask you, though, something. After I got out of the hospital and after I recovered, and in order to be able to get the vaccine, I did have to wait a little bit. Why is that? I thought I had the antibodies, but you have to actually wait a couple of months before you get the vaccine after you had COVID, correct?
Right. So there are a couple concerns. The first concern is a vaccine supply issue. So we know with good, reliable data that you have 90 days of protection after you've had COVID because your own immune system has generated antibodies already. So if you wait 90 days, you might make that vaccine dose available for someone who is vulnerable but has not yet had COVID.
Okay.
Secondly, there is concern that your immune system still reacting to COVID might spike up again and have a hyperactive response to the presence of the vaccine. And then the last concern is that the antibodies generated by the vaccine may in some way compete with the antibodies that your immune system is actually generating. So you want the most robust antibody response that you can.
That's great. Erik, when you were hospitalized, you and another patient prayed together. You were talking about this nurse, Nancy, but you actually prayed together at a distance with somebody.
Yes, I did.
Can you tell us about that?
I tell you what, this was a woman, I didn't even catch her name, but this was a woman in her 80s. She literally had stage 2 or stage 4 cancer because of HIPAA laws. I was not able to find out, but one of the nurses did tell me that she probably is never going to go home. And I literally heard her in the I'm sorry if I'm getting a little choked up here, but I heard her crying and praying in the room next to me. And I knew that she was a believer. And we started by just kind of tapping on the wall, and then it turned into actual prayer between the two of us. And I got to tell you, that was the hardest thing to do, was when, after the 5 days, when they brought my oxygen level, I was at 20% to 15% to 10, and then eventually went down to 0. And when I was at 0 and they released me, that was the part. I didn't want to go home because I didn't want to leave her there. But, you know, I got to tell you that God had me there for a reason, and it was to be able to pray with this woman. And, you know, we were there together, and it was at times you could literally feel the Holy Spirit between the wall.
And that's what the church teaches, that there's that grace in suffering and purpose to suffering. How are you now? How are you doing? Are you completely recovered?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. I do, because I had COVID pneumonia. My lung capacity is still not 100% yet. Doctors say that it's going to take about a year to be able to get 100% lung capacity. But you know, I'm running around the Capitol trying to chase after those lawmakers and get them on the record. And at times, I have to tell the photographer, "Hey, let's just kind of stop a little bit and catch our breath." But no, I'm on the road to recovery. But I tell you what, it's the millions out there that still are battling this thing. And the isolation. That's what I want to get to, is the isolation. If we can just continue to keep them in their prayer, in our prayers, and just continue. I mean, good doctors like the doctor there, is just be there for them, you know, and be able to listen to them.
We absolutely want to do that.
I think it's really important to emphasize that we have an opportunity, despite all the tragedy of the pandemic, to exhibit real solidarity as doctors, nurses, therapists work with these patients to all kind of suffer together and to battle back this isolation that you're talking about. Patients who have suffered through this can share their experiences and show solidarity with others, and it's really a act of charity and love towards neighbor.
It certainly is. You know, I got to tell you, Doctor, this has just been an amazing experience to have the nurse there pray with me, and then that just makes the hours and the days go by just so much faster.
Dr. Fernandes, I have one last burning question for you. You've given us this great advice. The government experts and the CDC say vaccines, continued masking and keeping a distance and getting back is what's going to get us back to normal. Is this your advice as well, just really quickly, so that we know what we should be doing?
I believe that you have to strike a balance between protecting the vulnerable and continuing to live as human beings, because we're meant to live together and flourish. We have to take care of our most vulnerable citizens. Of course, I believe vaccination and preparing the immune system to fight this battle is our most important weapon, and being sensible about staying home when you're sick, washing your hands, etc. So those are the key points that will get us out of this pandemic and allow us to flourish together as a community and as a church.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Erik, for your personal story.
Thank you.
We'll be praying to make sure you can keep running after those people on the Hill.
Thank you so much.
You can tell that this wasn't an easy conversation for Erik, but we thank him for sharing his story and Dr. Fernandes for his expertise. We're back in a minute with This Week in Review, top headlines, plus the Charleston Diocese says South Carolina is discriminating against Catholics. We'll explain. Topping the news in the Week in Review, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin sits in solitary confinement in a Minnesota maximum security prison. What his murder conviction in the death of George Floyd might mean for police reform is now in debate. After 3 weeks of testimony, it took a jury just 10 hours to find Chauvin guilty on all 3 counts of murder and manslaughter in Floyd's suffocation death. Chauvin was handcuffed and led to prison, where he is being held in a single cell for his own protection. Sentencing will be in 2 months. The most serious charge carries up to 40 years in prison. The verdict was met with jubilation and relief by many, as cities across the nation had braced for potential unrest if the verdict had gone the other way. Advocates for police reform say the hard work is ahead as lawmakers try to find common ground to pass legislation that addresses police training and misconduct. In the meantime, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced the Justice Department is launching a sweeping investigation into police practices and use of force in Minneapolis. There's progress in the fight to curb racial violence against Asian Americans. In a rare bipartisan vote, the U.S. Senate has passed an anti-hate crimes bill aimed at addressing a surge in attacks against Asian Americans. The vote was 94-1. The bill now goes to the House, where it's expected to be approved. The bill would enable enforcement agencies to better track hate crimes, establish reporting hotlines, and expand public awareness campaigns. President Biden had urged approval for the legislation in the wake of a shooting last month that claimed the lives of 6 Asian women outside Atlanta. President Biden hosted a 2-day virtual summit of world leaders this week in a global call to action to address the climate crisis. In discussions with more than 40 heads of state, Biden committed the U.S. to reducing its greenhouse emissions by more than 50% by the year 2030. He said clean economies can mean booming economies, creating millions of good jobs.
I talk to the experts and I see the potential for a more prosperous and equitable future. The signs are unmistakable. The science is undeniable. But the cost of inaction keeps mounting.
During the summit, climate was also described as a national security issue. Climate disasters, droughts, floods, rising waters, and threatening the internal stability of all nations. Pope Francis delivered a short video message to the summit, wishing the world leaders success and telling them he's, quote, with them all the way. He urged participants to work to make the post-pandemic world cleaner, more pure, and preserved. The Pope has made his concern for the environment a hallmark of his papacy, denouncing wealthy countries for what he describes as a plundering of God's creation for profit. The papal charity Aid to the Church in Need says at least 2/3 of the world's population live in countries that violate their religious freedom. Its annual Religious Freedom Report says the most persecuted religious group is Christians and that they're being increasingly targeted by authoritarian governments. The report denounces the rise of sexual violence used as a weapon against religious minorities, including crimes against women and girls who are abducted, violated, and forced to convert to another religion. Religious discrimination is a focus of a new lawsuit in South Carolina. The Diocese of Charleston is joined by a coalition of independent colleges, including historically black colleges and universities, in a push to remove a controversial amendment from South Carolina's state constitution. They claim South Carolina's Blaine Amendment discriminates against Catholics and African Americans. Here to explain this lawsuit is Daniel Sir, an attorney for the Liberty Justice Center, which filed the lawsuit. And to weigh in on the impact this amendment has had on Catholic schools is the principal of St. Anthony of Padua Catholic School in Greenville, South Carolina, Mary Margaret Martin. Thank you so much for joining me, both of you. Daniel, let's start with you. Can you give us a brief explanation of what Blaine amendments are?
Absolutely. The Blaine Amendment is this racially and religiously discriminatory constitutional provision in South Carolina that's sadly emblematic of constitutional provisions in states across the country. In the late 1800s, there was a wave of immigration coming to the United States from places like Ireland and Poland and Italy. It was overwhelmingly Catholic, and unfortunately, it sparked a shameful nativist response. And this anti-immigrant sentiment became embodied in a movement to bar public funds from going to Catholic and other religious schools that would serve these new immigrants. And so across the country, over 35 states adopted these so-called Blaine Amendments, named after their national champion, a long-dead congressman from Maine called James G. Blaine. They adopted these Blaine Amendments in about 35 states, and a lot of them, including South Carolina, are still on the books over a century later, and they are still preventing Catholic and other faith-based institutions from having equal access to educational funding. That's a shame, and it's why we brought this lawsuit.
It is a shame. Mary Margaret, why did your school think it was necessary to fight the South Carolina Blaine? Are you being denied COVID relief funds?
We are, and during these precedented times of COVID and having to the students to go face-to-face or virtual, it has just been really difficult for the school just to maintain its financial stability. We need these funds. We need equal access to everything, and we need just a level playing field for all of the students, regardless of religion and race.
And
the
Mary
students
Margaret,
are actually
sorry, were your schools open right away? Did your schools open in the beginning?
We did. I'm at a school that serves African Americans, primarily poverty and below, and we were able to go ahead and in August go ahead and introduce a in-person learning, the full school day with face-to-face instruction in the classroom. So it was ideal for our students, because with the students needing this time from their parents so the parents could work, we had to go ahead and make sure that we were providing a safe and stable environment for them. So because of all of the extra necessities that we had, sanitation, new computers, lower class size, we are really, really in a bind, and we needed this money so that we were able to provide that safe and loving environment that our students deserve.
I'm sure those children really were appreciative of that. Daniel, really quick, from a legal perspective, what did the recent Supreme Court decision that was set to strike down Blaine amendments last summer actually do, and is it useful to you here?
Yeah, absolutely. Last summer, the Supreme Court decided a case called Espinoza versus Montana, and it laid down a fundamental principle of First Amendment law. States cannot discriminate against faith-based institutions simply because of their religious faith. That should be obvious, but it took a Supreme Court decision to lay that law down for the country. South Carolina is a little unique. Along with some other states' Blaine amendments, it bans funding for both private secular and private faith-based schools. So our case is the next extension, the next step that comes after Espinoza, and we really need to fix not just some of the Blaine amendments. Espinoza was a great start, but we need to fix all of the Blaine amendments and wipe this religious bigotry off the books in every state, including South Carolina.
Thank you so much, Daniel. We look forward to watching you do that. Thank you for joining us, Mary Margaret, as well.
Thank you.
The country's largest Christian university is suing its former president, Jerry Falwell Jr., for tens of millions of dollars in damages. Its lawsuit, Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, claims Falwell negotiated a lucrative employment agreement in 2019 while withholding damaging information about a personal sex scandal. That scandal exploded into public view last year, and Falwell resigned under pressure. Liberty says Falwell's actions have damaged the school's reputation and hurt enrollment and fundraising. In a statement, Falwell said the lawsuit is full of lies and half-truths. Falwell had served as university president since 2007 after the death of his father. The Reverend Jerry Falwell founded the university in 1971. Its strong evangelical identity has made it a powerhouse player on the Christian right and a must-stop destination for conservative politicians. A man credited with redefining the role of the American vice presidency is being remembered fondly across the political spectrum. Walter Mondale died earlier this week at his Minnesota home. He was 93. Serving under President Jimmy Carter, Mondale was the first vice president to have an office in the White House and to take on a large portfolio of both domestic and foreign policy issues. Having set the example, all vice presidents since have also played consequential roles. Mondale was the Democratic nominee for president in 1984, but lost in a landslide to Ronald Reagan. He was remembered for naming Geraldine Ferraro as his vice presidential running mate, the first major party candidate to put a woman on the ticket. Memorials for Walter Fritz-Mondale are planned in both Minnesota and Washington, D.C.
I want to get my wife and my kids and people to heaven. It becomes more real, I think, when you almost lose your life.
Sick with COVID and near death, we go on this man's faith journey. A family and church community in prayer giving him the strength to live on. His story next. The tragedy of the coronavirus has touched many lives. Lost loved ones, struggles for those who have gotten seriously ill. Reporter Mark Irons introduces us to a man who says the coronavirus would have killed him if it were not for the power of prayer. Here's his story, his faith journey in depth.
We talk a lot about the power of prayer, and I felt like I got to experience it in a real and meaningful way.
To put it even more pointedly, late last year, then 44-year-old Jason Shanks nearly died from COVID-19. The president of the Our Sunday Visitor Institute says he was prayed back to life. Jason would need a ventilator to help him breathe. When his wife, Melissa, found out, she knew his condition was serious.
That's always a very scary news because you definitely hear once people go on vents, they don't come off vents.
At the time, Melissa couldn't visit Jason in the hospital due to restrictions, so she asked him to text her goodbye notes for their kids, just in case.
I mean, can you imagine having to think about in the spur of a moment, what's the last thing you're going to say to each one of your children that they'll remember for the rest of their life?
Jason's condition would get much worse. He caught bacterial pneumonia and developed a blood infection. His body began shutting down as he went on kidney dialysis. He was losing the battle to COVID.
We were asking everyone for prayers, and that's whenever someone had suggested to me Novena to St. Jude, and I wasn't that familiar with it. And I looked at it, and I was like, this is perfect, because it's a novena for lost causes.
Melissa rallied support online, and global prayers came pouring in. On December 15th, 9 days of prayer to the patron saint of lost causes began. On the second day, things began to change.
And so he got a negative COVID test, and he got his best chest x-ray that he had had since he went into the hospital.
On the 9th day, a prayer vigil was held outside the hospital. Jason was on the road to recovery. Melissa at his side throughout.
The courage that she showed, the love that she showed, the advocacy that she showed, and the amount of things that she went through in particular. I mean, in many ways, I think this is a story more about her than me.
Both say the trying time was an example of their marriage vows lived out, and their community pitched in.
People stepped up to provide assistance, whether it was food or whatever needs the family had.
A friend of Jason's, Bishop Kevin Rhodes of Fort Wayne South Bend, visited him, celebrated Mass, and gave Jason the Eucharist for the first time since being in the hospital.
I thought, okay, it's him and I. This will be a 30-minute Mass. No, we did the full thing, right? We did everything in a homily, and he brought it. He was really fantastic. So I was really grateful.
And actually, I had a lot of joy. I felt like a parish priest again, but I was just so grateful for his recovery. We had prayed so hard and we were hoping.
For Melissa, that hope brought lessons in trust.
Clearly, an amazing amount of trust and just literally not knowing what the step is going to be in front of you, but knowing that it's God's will.
All right. Weight on the left.
Yep.
And as Jason took slow steps to recovery, reality became even more clear.
For me, it's a greater recognition that life is temporary and a greater focus on eternal salvation.
Mark Irons, EWTN News In Depth.
Jason and Melissa, thank you for sharing your story, a beautiful witness of the power of prayer. Each week, we end our program with Images of the Week, photography from around the world of our Catholic life. We've shown you a lot of beautiful imagery, mostly from EWTN photographers at our Vatican Bureau. Now, we want to start seeing photos from you, our viewers. This week, we start our photo sharing with pictures I took recently on a trip to Salt Lake City, Utah. The beautiful Cathedral of St. Mary Magdalene is the spiritual home of the Salt Lake City Diocese. Construction began in 1900 and was completed in 1909. The interior was later enhanced with colorful murals and ornate shrines inspired by the Spanish Gothic style. It's the only cathedral in the U.S. under the patronage of St. Mary Magdalene, and it's listed on both the Utah and National Registries of Historic Places. We invite you to submit video or still shots from your parish experience, not just beautiful buildings, but the people and the events that enrich your Catholic life. Each week, we'll select one person's submission to share on the air, and we'll post the other images online. Send an email and attach either still photography or video to EWTN News In Depth. You can also submit your images via Facebook Messenger or Twitter direct message. And remember, there's lots more to see from EWTN News In Depth. We invite you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And that's a wrap on this edition of EWTN News In Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. See you again same time next week as we continue the conversation on issues of importance to our Catholic community.